historian, you know all about things that a lot of Sacramentans don't know anything about. Tell me, what are some of the greatest stories never told about Sacramento history?
That's most of its history. Generally, if you grow up in Sacramento and you go to the standard places to learn about local history, you learn about the gold rush, you learn about Sutter's Fort, you learn about the Transcontinental Railroad, and then there's sort of an unspoken assumption that nothing really worth talking about has happened here since 1869.
Which isn't true.
That was kind of the point of my studies, is what happened in between then and now. And what I found is that an urban place happened. It was, during much of the late 19th century, the second biggest city in California. And definitely came into competition with San Francisco, with Los Angeles, and ended up in some ways losing that battle, but also finding its own identity as a place. You had successive generations of capitalists, the people who basically took over business from the Big Four who built the railroad and then moved to San Francisco. Successive generations that built department stores and other economic empires, and also had farming interests, later on real estate development interests, and then successive stories of generations of immigrants and migrants, people who came to Sacramento in search of a better life. And there's an astounding diversity to that history, and that's something you don't hear about too. I grew up in the suburbs of Sacramento, and just sort of always assumed that Sacramento was really this very Caucasian place, this very white place. And when you really get into the meat of Sacramento history, it's astonishing, the diversity of it and the strength of some of those immigrant and migrant communities. And a lot of it's just sort of been masked over or overlooked. And part of what I want to do is shed light on those communities.
What are some of the cultures in Sacramento that interest you that don't get talked about a lot?
Some of the earliest immigrants, it was really all over, the whole world rushed into Sacramento. Sacramento's early African-American community was very small, but very, very well organized, very politically savvy. They had to be. They had come to a state where half the population wanted them completely driven from the state, and the other half wanted to enslave them. So they had to be able to think on their feet and organize politically, which they did. There were a series of colored conventions, they were called, in the 1850s right here in Sacramento, because we had the first two West Coast congregations of African American churches. Beyond that, the Chinese were also a large immigrant population. Another one that's well known, Sacramento's Chinatown is called Yifao, second city, after San Francisco was, of course, the big city, and then stopped in the third city, and so on. After the Chinese immigration tapered off, Japanese started moving in because Japan had opened up. They were no longer a closed country, and a Japanese farmer could move to California in search of work. And in a lot of ways, because China had been closed off by the United States, they didn't want more Chinese, Japanese immigrants started filling the same roles until the same kind of racial fears were marshaled against the Japanese, and similar sort of lies and laws were applied to them. Then in the early 1900s, you started to get immigrants from Mexico. Of course, California had been Mexico, and there are parts of California that always retained that traditional Californio-Mexican population. Sacramento wasn't really one of them, but around the period of 1910, you started to get a migration escaping revolution in Mexico, and a Sacramento barrio formed. And it has its own culture, its own businesses, its own community centers, its own worship organizations and social organizations, and it develops from there. There's also the Italian and Portuguese populations, which kind of grew up side by side, very quickly taking over the area of Southside Park, establishing their own church and community centers there. And it continues to this day. Sacramento has the oldest mosque in the western United States because we had a very early population of migrants from Pakistan, or what's now Pakistan, it was India at the time. And then Sacramento County had a large population movement from Southeast Asia, so from Vietnam, Cambodia, we have a large Hmong population. And so it's never stopped. We've always been this receiving point for immigrants looking for a better life, because usually they're able to find it.
Is it true that the African American population kind of skyrocketed during World War II?
Yes, during the period of Japanese internment, Japantown, the area that's now Capitol Mall, was effectively vacated by executive order that moved Japanese Americans into internment camps. But there was a massive demand for labor in the waterfront industries because we had all sorts of canneries, we had an active docks and multiple railroads right there, and there were a lot of African Americans looking for work, mostly from the South, who moved to California. So in 1942 or thereabouts, the African American population tripled. They were already there, had been since the gold rush, as I mentioned, but all of a sudden there were a lot more who were coming from a very, very different place, and where the African American community here sort of had an established role in the community and weren't really that able to break out. This new population was much more used, I think, to a level of advocacy that Sacramento's forebearers a century earlier had been used to. And so within a few years, you had a tremendous increase in African American owned businesses, African American roles in the professions, in local government, the first African American policeman in Sacramento, the first judge, the first doctor, the first attorney were a product of that generation. They're best known, or at least most recognized in local history, by the jazz clubs of the West End. But they were part of a larger musical community in what used to be a very strong, very active, and pretty well-known live music scene right here in Sacramento.
Like jazz bands?
Yes, jazz for the most part, but slowly blending into Western swing and rockabilly and rock and roll in the 1950s.
Bill, I want to talk with you more about the music scene, the history of the music scene in Sacramento coming up in another video.